Sean.
Okay, Tov, Shavua Tov. Wonderful to see everyone here. Wonderful to see an iPad still with people zooming in. And welcome to Rita Geller, who's joining us from Boca Raton, and all those who are online in Florida and here in Chicago. Wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much to Mishpachat Geller and extended family for making this morning possible. It's a great scoop again to be here to pay tribute to Howard Geller from Libracha. Mentioned a few times Dover Shalom Bolzaro. He really was a person of peace within his family, but also in our community. And it was always a joy to see him, to welcome him, to daven with him, learn with him. And just to point out that we're gathering on a Sunday. We typically have this lecture on a Sunday. We welcome back Shay Schachter. Zebda is going to say a few words in a moment about his prophecy of the bracha. Saw the other day this beautiful Sefer from Yerushalayim, Shvilei Pinchas. He writes that actually every Motzei Shabbos, when we take out the Besamim and then we look at the Ner, there's a little bit of a subtle hint to our heroes from this coming week. We have the Haftorah that we often read on fast days in the book of Yeshaya, the idea that Tachat Hanatzutz Yaleh Berosh Tachat Sirpai Yaleh Hadas, from different kinds of brambles, different kinds of vegetation that could be considered sharp and negative, we have ultimately the emergence of that which is aromatic and that which is pleasant. Of course, the word Hadas, in fact, the Gemara says this refers to all the different characters, so to speak, in the Megillah. And Hadas, of course, Hadas is Esther, Hamalka. So the Shvilei Pinchas writes, and you smell the Besamim every Motzei Shabbos, you think a little bit, even in times of darkness, the subtlety of the relationship to the legacy of Esther Hamalka. And of course, looking at the Ner, Mordechai is Ben Yair, and the idea that he was Heir Ne'er Shel Yisrael, the Gemara says that he enlightened the eyes of the Jewish people through his actions, through his inspiration. Obvious, they don't have to even say. There's a line from the Megillah every Motzei Shabbos, and like William Maisa, or somebody say every Saturday night, it's the same thing. So the idea that sometimes there's a verbalization of a legacy, and sometimes the subtlety of different cues, things that happen, moments that we find ourselves in, where we picture the image of a certain legacy, or we remember someone or an event alike. I must tell you, even with all the beautiful refurbishing that's going on in the shul, Lahadri L'Chadesh, our Makom Tefillah, sometimes when the building is empty, like in the middle of the day, I'll walk out into the hall, and in my mind's eye, I'll see Howard Geller coming in from the door, from the Dempster door, for the 8 o'clock Shacharis. I miss him. Not just the family, the congregational family misses him. And this is a fitting tribute to his legacy. We all learned Torah together, Margaret together. Who better than to bring in Shay Schachter, a friend and colleague from New York, whose reputation precedes him. And I'll leave it to Zev to make a formal introduction. We were so to see each other just a short time ago. And a great supposed to welcome him this morning to Or Torah here for this memorial lecture. So I'm going to ask Zev to come up, and welcome to everyone. We're looking forward to a wonderful morning this morning, and especially wonderful shir. And Yehizi Ro Baruch, this member should be a blessing. We'll continue now. Zev, come on up and say some nice words about Papa.
Is it? It's like my bar mitzvah. Under parents, rabbis,
You can consider at the end.
They say the human brain starts working the moment you are born and never stops until you stand up to speak in public. So here goes up. Papa was the head of our family, a pillar of the community, and a staunch supporter of Jewish education, and an avid emailer. I still have over 1,500 unread old emails in my AOL inbox. Lukute Pshatim, Congregation Oratory emails, you name it, it's all there. Frame Chicago. The matriarch of our family is obviously our Schachter. She's wonderful, she's beautiful. Suffice it to say, Schachter, if you're there, I don't know if you're there. She's there. You are the best. And speaking for everyone in the room here, we love you. I hope Uncle Mark won't complain too much when I say that Schachter was Papa's Ezer Kenegdo, Eshet Chayil Tzedekis. Did I get that right? Got it. Okay. They're a true force to be reckoned with, and those who saw them together were witness to pure love, respect, and commitment. They also made it quite the duet when singing Happy Birthday over the phone. The strength of Papa and Savta's relationship and values have been passed down to their children and grandchildren. It is no coincidence that every blood member of the family has chosen a person with that similar value of commitment to family, community, and education. I have many memories of coming here for shul when I was in grade school. There was always some candy in Papa's tallis bag. And when sitting with my dad, my Papa, my uncles, my cousins, all in a single row here in shul, there was always some time, in no particular order, for davening, Torah, sports debate, and a short nap. Since his passing, though, it has been my privilege to wear Papa's tallit on Shabbat. But it's not really my tallit. Whether we're at a family simcha or on Hagim, the question is always, are we using Papa's tallis? If you've looked at the Geller family on the men's side of davening during Birkat Kohanim, you know what I'm talking about. There's now a whole new generation of kids underneath the tallit, and we've had to expand to extra overflow of talisim. The tallit is more than just a connection to Papa, though. It has been and continues to be a place for us to celebrate together. Papa's legacy and tallit are an inspiration for us all. My cousins and I all have special memories of how Papa treated us like we were the most important thing in this world. For the longest time, I thought that Papa had invented the Papa Special. Every detail mattered to him, from sports games to how we were getting along with school, with our friends, with our siblings. He just made us all feel special. And in some way, he had that same effect on so many other people we encountered. Since moving back to Chicago, I've had many conversations with people who have mentioned that they have a connection or a story about Papa. And every single story boils down to a word that I've already used twice: commitment. Commitment to family, commitment to community, commitment to Jewish education. The Geller and Alter families, thank you all for coming here in person or on Zoom. And I hope that my little intro here will give everybody a little bit of a feeling of how extraordinary our Papa was, but also some inspiration to enhance your commitment to any of these three tenets of Papa's life. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rabbi Shay Schachter. Rabbi Schachter lives with his wife Rena and their young children in Woodmere, New York. He serves as rabbi and Rosh Beis Medrash at Young Israel of Woodmere. There are a bunch of other things Mark told me to say, but Rabbi Schachter cut me short.
Good morning, everybody. Shavua Tov. Really a pleasure to be here. It's a somewhat bittersweet day for the family, I understand, but what a beautiful introduction by a grandchild to talk about his loving memories of his grandfather. And what a great way to pay tribute by gathering together as a community, learning together in his memory, and thinking about what his legacy should mean to all of us and what we can take away from the legendary life that he lived. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity once again. It's a great schus to teach Torah, wherever it might be, and especially to come here. Mark just reminded me that the first time I was here was right before the pandemic. It was probably a week before everything shut down, and it's just such a whirlwind of an experience to think about what we've been through over the last 2 years. Last year we had the shiur on Zoom, and that was also wonderful, but there's nothing that can compare to coming, learning, and sharing in our thoughts together here in person. So really, I thank you all for putting this together. Thank you, Rabbi Engel, for the warm invitation as well. It's always great to spend time with Rabbi Engel, and we had the opportunity just a few weeks ago. We should share many, many more, wherever they may be, all good places that we meet each other, and Mirza Hashem, we should have many, many more opportunities in the future. So as we all know, we're just a few days away from observing the festive holiday of Purim. And it happens to be that Purim has so many details to manage, to think about, to prepare for, and to arrange. And it's a very hectic time. If you have young children, you're thinking about which friends are we going to go to, and what kind of mishlach manos are we going to give, and are they going to be happy with the costumes that they have? And everyone's busy trying to figure out how to make their children happy. We have matanos le'evyonim. It sounds easier than it actually is to figure out who can we really give the matanos le'evyonim to that will really benefit, that will be impacted in a positive way by what it is that we give them. It's not so simple to always get it right. And we have the Sudas Purim. Where are we going to eat, and who are we going to eat with, and what's going to be included in that? And obviously, Mikra Megillah, which shul are we going to daven in? And do we feel safe and comfortable going to that shul? And how are we going to do it? And which Balkori do we appreciate? And how many people are going to be there? And are there going to be too many children making noise? And all of these considerations, we have so many things in our minds just leading up to Purim. The problem is that often when it comes to Purim itself, with all the busyness and the frenzy that we have with the lead up and the build up to Purim, sometimes we don't have the opportunity to fully focus and concentrate on the critical messages of the Megillah itself. And there are so many relevant takeaways that we can really learn from the Megillah because it's such an incredibly powerful story. And this is really an opportunity for us just a few days before Purim to maybe think a little bit about some of the storyline of the Megillah. So before we begin today's shir, and again, I thank everyone for coming. I know it's not easy. I can tell you if we would have a shir in Woodmere at 10:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning, there would be no one other than myself standing there. So I am very glad to see that the minhag here is very different. And kol hakavod to all of you. I thank you for coming out. Before we begin, I have to give credit to someone by the name of Tzachi Trachtengut. I don't know who he is, but a number of years ago, I read an article that he wrote in Hebrew, which was a phenomenal article that was published in one of the publications in Israel. At the time, I had written down a number of comments from what I saw in there, and I really give him credit for many of today's themes because I was very, very taken by much of what he had shared. The Megillah is a fairly familiar story to all of us. We read it every year, but somewhat obscure. We don't know exactly what the storyline, the timeline was. Just by way of introduction, sometimes we read the Megillah. I don't know how fast the Balkori reads here, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, 25 minutes, whatever it may be, however skilled you might be. But sometimes we have the mistaken impression that all of this happened very quickly. But the truth is, it was at least 9 or 10 years for this entire protracted narrative to play out. This was not a story that was understandable at the time. One event happened, another event happened, and nobody was putting together the dots. So that's one issue to think about. But what exactly was the historical context of the Megillah story itself? And it's important to understand. So the story commences, as we know, with the introductory words, Vayhi bimei Achashverosh. The story actually happened in the days of Achashverosh. Who was Achashverosh? Now, it's interesting, when you look through the stories in Navi, I remember last time I was here, Rabbi Brand gave a Navi shir right before I began. I don't know if he's still learning Nav, but it's wonderful to learn Navi and to understand the stories of the Nevi'im and the messages. But when you learn through Tanakh, not always is it clear what the context of those stories are either. For example, we know the story of Eov. The Gemara is not even sure if Eov ever existed. The Rambam says maybe he was just a fictional character. So isn't it important to know who his contemporaries were, who his friends were, where he lived, which community he was a part of? And the answer is not necessarily, because the messages of Eov and many of the Nevi'im are timeless. They are immortal. And it doesn't really matter where they live and who they interacted with, because their messages are relevant for all times. When the Navi goes out of its way to tell us exactly in which period in history a story unfolded, when the Navi gives us the details of exactly what happened, it obviously means that that historical context is extremely important to appreciating and understanding the story. So here we have an introduction that is given by Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, which means that it's obviously important for us to know that this happened in the time of Achashverosh's leadership, in the time of Achashverosh's rule. And why is that important? So let's just begin to understand. Rashi, in the first pasuk of the Megillah, describes who Achashverosh was. I'm going to read Rashi's words where he says, Melech Paras Haya. Achashverosh was the Persian monarch. He was the emperor. He was the king. Shemalach Tachas Koresh. He took over the mantle of leadership after Koresh. We're going to see in a minute who that was. L'sof Shivim Shana Shel Galus Bava. When did Achashverosh take over? After Koresh passed away. He was the first king of the Persian Empire. And then this also happened to coincide with the 70 years after the exile in Babel began. That's the context, that's the story, that's the background that Rashi gives us. Now, who was Koresh? Koresh was the first king of the Persian Empire. Koresh was the one who gave permission to the Jewish community at the time to return to the land of Israel, and not just to return, but also gave an allowance to them to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. And this was should have been a glorious period in Jewish history. The Psukim tell us, actually in Navi Yeshaya, he refers to Koresh as Mashiach. He refers to Koresh as the savior of the Jewish people, because here we were in exile. Everyone was out of the land of Israel. Nobody was really thinking about a Beis Hamikdash, and Koresh came along and galvanized the people that they should once again reimagine a possibility of life in the land of Israel, in Yerushalayim, with a Beis Hamikdash as the focal point once again. So Koresh is given very great honorifics by the Navi Yeshaya. But the truth is, before the exile even began, the Nevi'im tell us in Yirmiyah that this was something that was known in advance would only last for 70 years. Let me just read you two passages. Yirmiyah Navi forecasts that the entire land will be destroyed. And the Jewish people will serve the Babylonian kingdom. They will be in exile for 70 years. That was told to them at the outset. And then, after 70 years, God already said from the outset that he was going to give an allowance for the Jewish community to return. And that is exactly what happened. The Psukim then reiterate that again and say for Yirmiyah Perek Chavtes, the Pasuk says, after 70 years being stuck in the exile in Babel, I will remember you, I will bring you back. And all of the Nevi'im at the time are forecasting exactly how this will play out. And that is what happens. Koresh is described in Sefer Divrei Hayamim as a magnanimous personality who goes out of his way to try to encourage the efforts of the Jewish people to return to their homeland. And the Psukim there describe that it was in the very first year of the rulership, of the leadership of Koresh, that he puts out a pronouncement. He lets out a notification to all the communities under his leadership, under his rule, that God has entrusted me, Koresh, to allow the Jewish people to return to Eretz Yisrael and to build a Beis Hamikdash. And that is the time that this story unfolds. Now, aside from the logistical challenges that obviously were facing the Jewish community at the time in building a Beis Hamikdash, there were also a number of halachic obstacles as well that had to be overcome. And these are discussed in a number of the Gedolei Achronim. So, for example, we know the Rambam tells us very clearly, it's based on a Gemara in Sanhedrin, that in order to have the license to build a Beis Hamikdash, you need to have a melech, you need to have a Jewish king. At the time, although the Jews were given an allowance to go back to Eretz Yisrael and to build a Beis Hamikdash, there was no king of the Jewish community leading the charge. So what right did they have to even start with this initiative? Who allowed them to even start with the project? Who allowed it to get underway? Question number one. Just something for you to consider. We're not going to get into it, but it's just something to think about. It sounds nice that Koresh gave the allowance and he gave the instruction and he gave all the permits that were necessary, but not so simple. It's not so simple at all. Aside from that, there is a clear indication in the Sefer HaChinuch that the only time you're allowed to build a Beis Hamikdash is when you have Rov Yisrael Shuriyim Al Adnasam, when you have most of the Jewish community living in Eretz Yisrael at the time, which many historians say now we're pretty close to that. Many sociologists say we're pretty close to half of the Jewish people in the world living in Israel, which is a very historic and very significant milestone should we get there, B'mheira v'yameinu. But be it as it may, you cannot begin to build a Beis Hamikdash until you have Rov Yisrael Shuriyim Al Admasam. It's clear in the Sefer HaChinuch and other Rishonim. So how is it that the Jewish community at the time had most of the population living outside of Israel, and yet they began in this process of rebuilding? Very serious questions, very serious impediments and obstacles, but somehow they got around all of this, and the construction begins. Very short-lived, because about 3 years into the leadership of Koresh, he passes away tragically, and that leads to the new king taking over, who was Achashverosh. Now, where Achashverosh came from is a story in and of itself, but Achashverosh now takes over the mantle of leadership. And tragically, at the time that this allowance to go back to Yerushalayim was given to the Jewish community, they responded very poorly. They responded totally inadequately, and it was a phenomenon and a reality that none of them really took seriously. The Psukim described in Sefer Ezra that at the time that he was going back to Eretz Yisrael, he couldn't even have enough Kohanim to run a Beis Hamikdash. He's looking around and he's trying to count, how many Kohanim do we need to have a functioning Beis Hamikdash? How many Leviim do we need? We don't even have a sufficient number with us now. And he goes back to try to get a few extra volunteers to come along. That's how poor the efforts were. That's how unsuccessful the Jewish community was, totally unenthusiastic. And the truth is that this was seemingly a conscious, a calculated decision on the part of many of the leading scholars of the time. Many of the Talmidei Chachamim, many of the dignitaries made a conscious decision to stay in Babel. How can that be? Why would they decide to remain in Babel? The Gemara seems to tell us in Maseches Megillah that Rav is of the opinion, Gadol Talmud Torah Yoser Binyan Beis Hamikdash. And after all, the citadels of Torah were outside of Israel at the time. And that was where the mainstay of the Jewish people were at the time. And to them, staying at the epicenter of Talmud Torah was more important than Binyan Beis Hamikdash, which is hard for us to understand. But it shouldn't be so hard to understand, because look around at all of us who live here in Chutz La'aretz today. And we have the opportunity for a great life in Eretz Yisrael. And we're given that gift and blessing that our grandparents would have given everything in the world to have. And yet, we have all kinds of reasons. Many of them are legitimate, some of them are illegitimate, but we have all kinds of reasons why we live in Chutz La'aretz. And again, for those of us who have legitimate reasons, it makes sense. And we sanction that. So you have the possibility of a geula right in front of you. You have God showing you in no uncertain terms that this is where the future of the Jewish people is going to play out. That is where Jewish history is supposed to be right now. And yet, many of the Jews, or a majority of the Jews, do not live in the land of Israel. So this is not such an unusual phenomenon. It is what the Gemara describes here, that the leaders of the time decided, made a conscious decision to stay where they were and not to heed the call of Ezra. You know, Soloveitchik wrote after the Holocaust, after the Shoah, a very famous essay called Dodido Fake, and you read it, and it's so powerful and it's so moving when he describes how God is knocking at the door and he's just asking his beloved to come home. And you say to yourself, how did people miss that message? This is a recurring theme, unfortunately, throughout history, that sometimes God gives messages and sometimes we don't always respond exactly how we should. And therefore, the Megillah tells us, Nikalu hayudim ba'arehem b'chol medinos hamelach Achashverosh. What does that mean? It means that there were clusters, there were pockets of Jews in the various communities scattered and dispersed around throughout the leadership of Achashverosh's reign. There were Jewish communities in all the different provinces, in different places, because they were not all centered and focused around Eretz Yisrael. They were scattered about in the exile. In fact, the Gemara tells us that they were punished for their lack of interest. They were punished for their lack of enthusiasm. So the Gemara says in Masechtas Brachos that at the time that they were given this clearance, this allowance to go back to Eretz Yisrael, we are told in the Gemara that God really intended that they should have miracles the same way Yoshua ben Nun. We're familiar with the story. Yoshua ben Nun came to the land of Israel and the walls of Jericho fell down. Unbelievable miracles. Really a spectacular, dramatic moment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu envisioned for Yoshua ben Nun and all of the generation of that time. And that was supposed to happen again. And the only reason why it didn't, says the Gemara, is Mishum Shegaram HaChet, because people disappointed God and therefore he couldn't go ahead. They were unworthy, they were undeserving. Rashi says, what did they do that they were undeserving of those great miracles? And Rashi explains it was the fact that they were indifferent, that they did not really pay attention. They were not excited about this opportunity of Binyan Beis Hamikdash. So Ezra goes to Eretz Yisrael with, as we mentioned, a very weak following, a negligible number of people who decided to follow him. And at the time, the locals who lived in Israel objected. They opposed to Ezra's building of the Beis Hamikdash, and they petitioned. They send a petition in the very first year of Achashverosh's rule, the Medrash tells us. They send a petition back to Achashverosh saying that they would like him to stop. They would like him to get in the way and cancel the plans of Binyan Beis Hamikdash. Achashverosh, in the end, has to consider that. He can't just ignore his own citizens, so he has to figure out what to do about that. And that is basically the backdrop of the Megillah. We had this very exciting moment, this very enthusiastic opportunity to build a Beis Hamikdash, which is ultimately stopped in its tracks. And Achashverosh, in his first year of rulership, has to figure out what to do with the Jews who are in Israel and the locals who are there, having all of these fights, all of these issues, trying to figure out how to go about it. So part of the issue here is that not only do you have the Jews living in exile, but also you have this devastating blow that they thought they would be able to experience a Beis Hamikdash that was going to be rebuilt, and now the plans are stopped in their tracks. When we read the Megillah, it seems almost as if Mordechai and his arch enemy Haman had some kind of run-in, and as a result, they came to hate, they came to despise each other. Mordechai la yichra v'la yishtachava. Seems that that's where the story begins, but the Medrash tells us it did not begin there at all. There was a great history to this relationship. And what was the backdrop of that relationship? The Medrash says as follows. As we just mentioned, there were locals in Yerushalayim, there were locals in Eretz Yisrael who objected to the building of the Beis Hamikdash. And the Medrash says, who were those individuals? Those were actually the Aseres B'nai Haman. They lived in Yerushalayim at the time. They were very concerned about the Jewish community coming back together and rebuilding their heritage and having a Jewish identity once again. And they were the ones who sent the objection to Achashverosh. At the time, Achashverosh was not sure exactly what to do, and the Medrash describes this and says that each faction of the community in Yerushalayim had to send a representative to Achashverosh to negotiate on their behalf. Well, who greater in the Jewish community to send than Mordechai? And as we are introduced to Mordechai in the Megillah, Asher Hagla Yerushalayim, Mordechai is the one who comes out of Yerushalayim, who is now stuck once again in Persia, in Galus. It's not where he wanted to be. He was part of the charge. He was part of the calling that was supposed to be in Eretz Yisrael, rebuilding a Beis Hamikdash. But he's the one who was sent as a representative. And who better to send from the other community than Haman? And that was the nature of their relationship. So this goes back. This is a deeply rooted dispute. This is a hatred that was not new at all. It is not because Mordechai lo yikra v'lo yishtachava. It is something that went back in history many, many years. But really, the crux of their dispute, the heart and the essence of their disagreement, was really one that was focused around Binyan Beis Hamikdash. Mordechai and his community were advocating for a geula, for a Beis Hamikdash to take root and be a possibility for the Jewish community. And Haman and his followers were objecting that at all costs. And that is where the relationship started. It was a toxic relationship for many, many years before. The landscape, the opening scene of the Megillah, is one that portrays the details of the Mishnah Achashverosh. So we read the story, but you look in the Gemara Megillah, nothing I'm saying today is a chiddush at all. I'm just trying to put together the Gemaras and give a little bit of a context to the Megillah. So the Gemara Megillah tells us that this was a blowout, lavish banquet. It was a feast like no one had ever experienced before in their lives. 180 days. Have you ever heard of anyone celebrating for 180 days? I mean, there are celebrations in the world, but 180 days? I mean, what happened to the economy in 180 days? Nobody was working. Nobody was doing anything. Everyone was just celebrating all day and night. Very strange, very hard to understand. It was totally over-exaggerated, this reaction of Achashverosh. And we're told in the Gemara every last detail, an assortment of every kind of fine wine and expensive cuisine and everything anybody ever could have imagined. All the delicacies and gourmet chefs were there, and kosher food and non-kosher food, whatever anybody wanted. Nobody was forced to take anything. You like desserts, take this. You don't like desserts, take that. You want to have breakfast? Mark offered me this morning. I'm a simple guy. I just had a tea this morning and that was perfect. So everything everybody could have ever wanted or imagined was there. And that's the way it was done. 180 days, a blowout festivity. But the Gemara tells us in Maseches Megillah that this date for the celebration was not something that was chosen arbitrarily at all. This was something that was not at random. This was a calculated and very specific time when Achashverosh decided to throw this party. You see, Achashverosh had a cheshbon. He had a calculation. He also knew the Nevi'im. I'm embarrassed to say I may not know the Nevi'im's words as well as Achashverosh knew them. We're a little bit lacking. But sometimes Achashverosh reflects back and says, hey, the Nevi'im actually promised the Jewish community that after 70 years, they're going to have the right to return. Here we are, and 70 years have passed, and I've made all the calculations possible, and it seems like this is never going to happen again. They were given an allowance to go build a Beis Hamikdash, but now we have stopped that in its tracks. Let us now celebrate that the Jewish people will never again have their own place, that the Jewish community will never again be their own people, that they will never have that focal point of the Beis Hamikdash. Let us now celebrate over the fact that that dream and that aspiration that Jews have always had is now obsolete. It is now gone. There is nothing that is a reality for them any longer. And that is why Achashverosh throws this party, to celebrate the fact that the Jews have not been successful in going back to the land of Israel, and that this will never again be a possibility for them. We read in the Megillah, there are a few sentences that we read, a few psukim, that we read in the tune of Eicha. One of them is when we talk about V'kelim shonim. And the Gemara tells us the reason why that's a very sad statement is because Achashverosh actually took the kalim from the Beis Hamikdash. And he used them at this banquet, at this party, and he said there is no reason to save these any longer. There will never again be a Beis Hamikdash. And this is why it just gives us a little bit of an explanation as to why the participation of the Jews at the time was looked at as such an offensive thing to do. What's so bad? So you go, you're invited. Rabbi Engel, you ever been at the White House Hanukkah party?
I'm not yet,
You've not, okay.
but if you know someone,
Here's Hashem.
I'm available.
You gotta know your congressman. I'll tell you this, it's not all that exciting. But I went with my wife, and it's very nice. They had kosher food. They sent you the pictures in advance of the kosher caterer coming and koshering the White House kitchen. It's pretty nice. And they have the Army and Navy band playing Hanukkah songs, and it's just a very nice evening. And what can be so bad? We didn't do anything wrong. We davened mincha there. We had a huge minyan for Mariv. Kurovam Hadros Melech. Hundreds of people are davening together. Wonderful. Jews of all different stripes and colors are coming together to celebrate Hanukkah, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox. Everybody's in the same room. It's wonderful. Kumbaya, it's great. What was so bad? So Achashverosh makes a party. He invites everyone equally. Equal opportunity. What's so terrible? What they do? Nobody ate not kosher food. Everybody was doing the right thing. They participated. But the backdrop of all of this was the celebration was implicit. That the understanding was we are celebrating the downfall of the Jewish community. We are celebrating the fact that the Jewish community will never again be considered the Am Segula, the Am HaNivcha. They are not the chosen people. They do not have a right to build a Beis Hamikdash. They do not have a right to live in their own land. And Achashverosh and all those who were there were celebrating the complete assimilation, the complete integration of the Jewish community into the Persian culture. If that wasn't bad enough, that the Jews did not heed the call of Shivas Tzion at the time, now you see that not only did they do that, but now they celebrate the fact that they are stuck in Gullus. They celebrate the fact that they are accepted members of society. They dig in their heels and they made it clear that they no longer believe that there was a possibility of redemption. They no longer believed there was a possibility of return at all, and that was a tragedy, that they lost their own identity, that they let their dreams and their aspirations and their beliefs go into the abyss. And that was the tragedy at the time of Achashverosh. The Chasam Sofer makes a historical observation. I guess it's a reflection, where he writes, he looked through history and he says, I'm going to read from his words, writes the Chasam Sofer, you see that there's a cycle of how things happen in the world. He says, we go through difficult times as a Jewish community. And we become a despicable nation, subhumans in the eyes of our enemies. Think no further back than 80 years. This is exactly the description that the Chasam Sofer is giving, but way before the Shoah. And this is what he describes. After that happens and they have this horrific experience, there's an aperture, there's an opening where the Jewish community feel that they're finally accepted and they get some religious freedoms. And they become successful in business, and the Jews are everywhere. And they're involved at all levels of government. You know that the head of cybersecurity for the Biden administration now is an Orthodox woman who grew up in Barakon, Connie Barfel. It's a pretty amazing testament to her successes and to what she has accomplished. But who would have dreamt, who would have imagined such a thing 80 years ago in one of the highest levels of government in the most powerful country in the world? And writes the Chasam Sofer that when we start to see this acceptance and we start to see that our position is finally being appreciated and understood, we start to feel finally we're accepted. Let's take advantage of this gift of acceptance. And we lose our identity. Right, Chasam Sofer, we lose that appreciation for what it means to be the Jewish people. And we no longer have that understanding of how lucky we are, how blessed we are to be the Am HaNivcha, to be the nation that is close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's interesting when you look back at Avraham Avinu, the father of our people. So we know that Avraham was given a name Abraham because Av Hamon Goyim Nisatif. On the one hand, Avraham Avinu was expected to be a universal personality. He was supposed to be cosmopolitan, he was global, he should be all over and involved in everything. And yet at the same time, Avraham Avinu was instructed to perform a bris milah. to uphold his sense of uniqueness and his own identity. And that is always the conflicting, contradictory values that Jewish communities need to live with. On the one hand, we are meant to be an Av Hamon Goyim. We are meant to be involved, but at the same time to keep to our principles and our values, and to keep our conscience and our morals where they should be, is a great challenge. And especially, writes the Chasam Sofer, when we are accepted by the local community, when we are given religious freedoms, when we are appreciated for who we are, it becomes even more difficult and it becomes even more complicated to keep up to that. So the backdrop of the Megillah is trying to reestablish a sense of Jewish unity and a sense of Jewish pride, and understanding that we need to focus once again on Yerushalayim, on Beis Hamikdash, on who we are, on really appreciating the value of what our people bring to the Jewish people and to the world. Chazal tell us in Bereshis Rabbah, Nasu b'nei Yisrael aguda achas, hiskinu atzmachem legeula. If the Jewish community will band together and become a unified, cohesive group, then, writes the Medrash, haskinu atzmam legeula, then we should anticipate the reality of a geula. And it seems that a prerequisite for geula is that we need to feel the sense of unity, we need to feel the sense of belonging, and the sense of being a cohesive unit, and understanding and appreciating what it means to be a part of the Am HaNivchar. So much so, the Medrash goes to an extreme and says, if you contrast David HaMelech with Achav, David was one of the most righteous kings that we ever had. David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. And yet Achav was one of the most despicable, horrible kings. As the Psukim tell us in Sefer Melachim, that Achav was a personality, shehichis es Hashem Elokei Yisrael mikol malchei Yisrael asher hayu lefanav. He was the one who angered God more than any other Jewish king. Achav was horrible. He murdered the Nevi'im. Achav was the one that served Avodah Zarah, did terrible things. The Gemara describes in Masechah Sanhedrin in the last parak. Achav was one of the most despicable human beings that is ever described in Tanakh. And yet, the Gemara tells us that Achav, when he went out to battle, was successful. And somehow he was able to win those battles. And somehow he was victorious. And yet, David HaMelech lost so many of them. And why is that? The Gemara says the reason why is because Achav, not the Gemara, the Medrash says the reason why is because Achav lived in a generation where they had a unified and united Jewish community, where they understood the value of what Jewish people are all about. Maybe they served Avodah Zarah, maybe they killed the Nevi'im, they did very egregious things in their experience. However, they appreciated what it meant to be a Jewish community. And you contrast that with David HaMelech, where there was so much disunity, where they were so disjointed, where nobody was able to appreciate each other. And that's why, says the Medrash, David HaMelech was unsuccessful in the places where Achav was successful, although Achav was one who was the Oved Avodah Zarah and Horeg es HaNevi'im. And when we are introduced to the Jewish people in the Megillah, so the claim, the assertion against them that Haman launches is that we are mefuzar or mefura ben ha'amim. That is exactly what he was describing. We have a Jewish community that wants to live in Israel. We have communities here that are b'chal arei medinos hamelech, that are scattered about all over. Nobody seems to feel a sense of Jewish pride and Jewish identity. Nobody seems to feel an urgency for the aspiration of a redemption of Geula. Nobody really feels a sense of need for a Beis Hamikdash, and they are scattered about. They are dispersed all across the land. They are divided. There is disunity, and they are disconnected with each other. And that is the greatest vulnerability. That is the greatest weakness of the Jewish people. That was their great shortcoming at the time of the Megillah. And that really is the backdrop of the entire story. When you think about this Geula versus a different kind of Geula, one of them that we're about to celebrate is Geulas Mitzrayim. On Pesach, obviously, we celebrate our redemption from Mitzrayim, but that was very different. There we were told, Hashem yilachem lachem v'atem taharishon. I don't expect anything of you. We're familiar with the Medrash that says that the Jewish community at the time was Memtes Shari Tuma. Couldn't get worse than that, lowest of the low. And God says, I'll take care of it. Hashem yilachem lachem v'atem taharishon. You sit back, just allow the miracle to unfold. Whereas here, in subsequent Geulas, God has an expectation of the Jewish people. God wants us to participate in an active way, and God expects us to do something. And step number one that the Medrash tells us is, we need to have that sense of Jewish unity, of Jewish pride, of understanding who we are, and appreciating what it is that we are all about, and our value and our focus. And so, the leader of the Jewish community at the time of the Megillah story was none other than Mordechai, undoubtedly. And he feels that his mission as the leader is to make the Jewish people feel, once again, that sense of pride, that they are the Am Segula, that they are the Am HaNivchar, that we need to think about a redemption, that we need to come together. We say it every day in our davening, Baruch Hu Elokeinu shebaranu l'chvodo. We thank God for making us who we are. And we thank God for singling us out. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol. Every tefillah that we daven, we end with these beautiful words that we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for making us the way that we have been created. Shelo asanu k'goyei ha'aratzos. We thank God for making us unique and special and different. That is what the Jewish community is all about. Ata v'chartanu mikol ha'amim. Ahavta asanu v'ratzisa banu. And it's something that sometimes we forget and we don't fully understand, we don't fully appreciate. Even as the story unfolds, Esther, you see, when the story begins and she has opportunity to make a difference. So the first thing that she's concerned about is her own well-being and her own safety. Esther is worried about her own protection. Am I going to be safe if I go in to negotiate with Mordechai? With Achashverosh. And what does Mordechai react? What does he respond? This is not a time to worry about yourself. The Tzav HaSha'ah. What we need to do right now, this is an unusual time. This is an opportunity. What we need to think about is not ourselves, it's about the Jewish people. Don't hide in the castle. You can have a great life there. But that's not what the times are calling for now. What the times are calling for is a Jewish pride, is connecting and seeing yourself as a part of the larger Jewish community. Remind yourself, Esther, God will make sure to save the Jewish people. God will never forsake the Jewish people. You need to make sure, if you want to be anything significant in history, you need to make sure that you identify with the Jewish people. I ask you, is there any other personality that lived at that time that you ever heard of? I would imagine there were millions of Jews alive at the time. And we only know of Mordechai and Esther. Basically, no one else. Maybe a handful. But that's it. And that's exactly what Mordechai is trying to impress upon Esther. It's not about you. You want that future generations should remember you? Then do something significant for the Jewish people. Then understand that this is not about you. This is not about your safety and your protection and your well-being. This is making sure that you identify with an unwavering commitment, an unshakable commitment to who the Jewish people are and what they represent. And it took a tremendous amount of courage and bravery, and it was not easy for Esther at all. And as she's focusing on this mission, I believe it's of no coincidence at all that immediately afterward, when she's tasked with this job of trying to step up and do for the Jewish community, what is the one thing that she asks in response from the Jewish people? The one thing that she asks is, Lech kenos es kol ha'yehudin. If you're asking me to have a sense of Jewish pride and Jewish identity, if you want for me to understand where my place is in the context of the Jewish community as a whole, I ask you to impress the same upon the Jewish community as well. Lech kenos es kol ha'yehudin. I'm going to do my part. But I want you to remind the community that they also need to come together. That is the prerequisite to a geula. That is what it's all about. We need to reclaim our identity. We need to reappreciate our uniqueness and what we're all about. And that is really what Esther tries to impress upon the community after Mordechai gives it to her and impresses this value and this mission on everything that she needs to do moving forward. She wants that the Jewish community should respond in kind and feel the same way. And when the tables turn and Achashverosh offers immunity to the Jewish people, what does he say? He tells them, Lihikahel v'la'amod al nafsham. You are now given the right not just to feel that you are free, not just to feel that you are safe, but now that you are safe, what are you going to do with that safety and that freedom? Lihikahel v'la'amod al nafsham. Achashverosh understood it. The job is to get together, to once again feel that sense of Jewish unity and Jewish pride. And this really was the transformation that we see in the Megillah. Going from a Am that is mefuzar u'mefurad bein ha'amim, a nation that was scattered, as the claim begins in the Megillah, that is what Haman lobbies against the Jewish community, to coming to an understanding in the end of Lech kenos es kol ha'yehudin, of lihikahel v'la'amod al nafsham, This was a metamorphosis that was undergoing the Jewish community at the time, and this is really the undertone of the entire story of the Megillah. It's where it all started, and that's where it all ends. That is the aspiration of what it means to be part of the Yom Segula, because that is a prerequisite. And it should come as no surprise at all that the choice rituals that the Megillah writes in commemorating this holiday, this Yom Tov of Purim, are all about Jewish unity and togetherness. Reb Shlomo Alkabetz famously writes in his Sefer Manos HaLevi, this is why we have Mishloach Manos. How come we don't have this idea any other time in the year? It's such a nice thing to do. Why not drop off gifts by other people's homes? Why not make them feel good about their relationship with you? But the understanding of the entire context of the Megillah was one of being a transformative experience from being mefuzar or mefurah ben ha'amim to landing in a place where it's mishloach manos ish l're'ehu and pulling the community together and understanding that this has to be the aspiration. This has to be the undertone of strengthening our relationships, of understanding and appreciating what a people who are together are all about. That is the takeaway message for all future generations as we read the Megillah and as we experience all that the Megillah wants to teach all of us in our generation so many thousands of years later. In fact, after all of Mordechai's heroic efforts, after all the courage and the daring responsibility that he takes upon himself, when the Megillah sums up the personality of Mordechai, what does the Megillah tell us? He Mordechai HaYehudi, Mishnah LaMelech HaChashverosh, of course he was a deputy in the king's cabinet. Of course he was a very important personality there because of everything he had done, but Ratzui L'Rov Echav, and he spent his time Dorish Tov La'amo V'Dover Shalom L'Chol Zaro. This was the entire mission of Mordechai at the time. He understood that this was the most important thing to do, and there was nothing more critical than that to show a friendly, loving, affectionate sense of appreciation for what it means to be a Jew, for what it means to be a part of this very blessed nation. And that, as we read the Megillah, is really what we need to be focusing on, because it is so clear that that is the undertone of everything that we read and of all that we experience. So we'll close in a couple of minutes. I see it's already late, and I'm sure everyone has things to do today. But let me just read a letter 100 years ago written by the Chafetz Chaim. It's a letter that I find so powerful. The Chafetz Chaim was well known to be a personality who so much aspired toward a geula. And he didn't just aspire in theory. The Chafetz Chaim believed that it was a reality that really could have been in his own life. So it's famous that they asked the Chafetz Chaim why he didn't have furniture in his home. And he told them, why would I invest in furniture if I'm going to have to move in just a couple of days? What's the point? I'm going to lose all of it. I'm not going to be able to bring it along with me to Israel. It is famous that the Chafetz Chaim had a suitcase in his home because he was always prepared that he's going to hear the coming of Mashiach and he's not going to have time to pack up his things. He always kept his suitcase packed. I once read a letter of the Chafetz Chaim that was so amazing. It was a letter where the Chafetz Chaim was responding to two businessmen in his community in Ram. And they made some kind of agreement with each other. They were opening a store. And the Chafetz Chaim says how they came to him after they made all the provisions. They wanted him to read it over and make sure that all of the conditions that they made for this business venture were based on the laws outlined in Shulchan Aruch and Choshen Mishpah. So they had every kind of stipulation you can ever imagine. So it said in there, what will happen if the store burns down? Who's going to suffer the loss? And what's going to happen if my wife gets sick? If your wife gets sick? What happens if I die? If you die? If my children take over? Your children take over? Every possibility. What happens if there's a flood and the merchandise gets ruined, but the shelves are still okay? Everything you can ever imagine was in that contract. And the Chafetz Chaim is reading it over and he begins to cry. And they asked him, what's the problem? And he said, you have thought of every stipulation, of every possibility in the world. Some of the most unusual circumstances are included in this contract. But two Jews that make a contract, it's more likely in your minds that there's going to be a hurricane and your store is going to be completely destroyed than the possibility that maybe Mashiach is going to come and both of us are going to have to move to Eretz Yisrael and we're just not going to be able to run the store anymore. That's less likely in your mind than everything you've outlined here in the contract. How can a Jew live like that? It's not who we are. So the Chafetz Chaim writes an amazing letter. And he says, Karav hadavar me'od, it seems to me, writes the Chafetz Chaim, I have a feeling, shezmanenu hu ikvasa d'Mashiach. He's writing this 100 years ago. Passed away in the 1930s. I don't think that feeling can be stronger than it is today. Karav hadavar be'enai, shezmanenu hu ikvasad Mashiach. Says the Chavetz Chaim, obviously we need to strengthen ourselves in many different areas, but he points out one area in particular. Laharbus Shalom Yisrael. To rebuild our sense of appreciation for other Jews who live in other communities than our own, or maybe in our own community as well. To just try to engender that sense of Shalom Yisrael. And he explains that we all know that we have this obligation. After all, he says, all of the destruction began, as the Gemara tells us, as a result of sinas china, as a result of a lack of appreciation for who the Jewish people are. It's a beautiful story I once read by the Imrei Emes, one of the Ger Rebbes, where he said that there was a family who had a number of children. And the minhag, the practice was in Europe that when they used to have a daughter who got married, so the son-in-law and the entire family would come to the in-laws' house every night for dinner. That was the arrangement. So there was a man in the community who had two children, two daughters, and both of them married, lovely guys, lovely young men. And both of them used to come every night with their families, and as the families grew, they continued to come every night to the in-laws for dinner. And the problem was that they had very different kinds of tastes. Both of them were hypersensitive and very specific in their diets. One of them was lactose, and he was lactose intolerant, he was unable to have any dairy products. And the other one was unable to have any meat products. He was a vegan. He was a vegetarian. So they had to eat on two different tables every night. One had to eat in the kitchen around with his family because they were eating milk. The other one had to eat in the dining room around the table with his family. They were eating meat. And it was a problem. But it was uncomfortable, but that's what it was. By Hiyayom, the Imrei Emes tells the story that this father-in-law lost all of his money. And now he was unable to provide the milk meal and the meat meal. And all he was able to bring home was a few potatoes and some onions. And that was the best he could do. And that night, everybody comes for dinner into the same house where they always came. And one family goes into the kitchen, sits around the table, and the other one goes into the dining room and sits around the table there. And the father turns to all of them and he says, how come we can't sit together when we're just eating potatoes and onions? See, I understand when you're eating meat and you're eating milk, we can't sit around the same table. But now all we have left is potatoes and onions, and we can't figure out how to sit around the same table. So the Imrei Emes says, did it make sense in the days of the Vilna Gaon and the Balatanya that they had major disagreements about very significant issues facing the Jewish community at the time? Yes, it made sense. Did it make sense at the time that for some reason the Baal Shem Tov had to sit at a table of his own and the Vilna Gaon had to sit at a table of his own, and they were very fierce advocates of their way of life? Yes, maybe it made sense. But now we live at a time where all we have left is just potatoes and onions. How much does the Jewish people today look around the assimilation rate? What are we left with? What do we have? Look how many people were murdered in Shoah. What are we left with already? All we have is potatoes and onions, and we're trying our best. We can't sit around the same table now with all that we have left. And that is our charge. That's our opportunity that we have. I'm sure many of us saw the email, saw the note from Natan Sharansky last week. Not sure if the rabbi mentioned it. I'm sure everybody saw it. There's no reason to repeat it. But let me just tell you one follow-up, one addendum to that beautiful comment of Natan Sharansky. And I was so moved when I saw what he wrote. But we had a few members of our community in Woodmere who actually went to Moldova last week to be on the front lines in the Ukrainian border, on the border of Ukraine and Moldova. And they went, it was part of a mission with Hatzalah Air. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there were a number of paramedics who had gone together to do whatever they can to help with humanitarian aid. They had asked me to join them. I was terrified. I was thrilled that in the end it didn't work out because I was just too scared to go, honestly. But, you know, at the time they said it may have been too early to go. There just wasn't clear exactly what a rabbi could have done out there. Although they were excited for me to go, I really wasn't sure that they had a definite plan of what exactly I was going to do. And I said, I'm open to going whenever the opportunity is available. And if you think I can do something significant, of course, I'll drop everything else and go and try to help. So they went. They came back Friday morning and I spoke with them. And they were there for 4 days or 3 days doing humanitarian work. And all of them are paramedics. And they're all members of Hatzalah. And they're all members of security teams in our community as well. They're just very involved community members, very special people. And one of them told me that the most moving moment for him was when he came to the Moldovan border, right over the border. And he said he was watching such confusion. He was watching families come out. He said almost no male members of Ukraine were coming out because they weren't allowed to. All of them were being drafted into the army. He said it was just women and children, all kinds of ages, all kinds of stages of life. And he said they were there as cancer patients were coming out. They were trying to give them treatments whenever they could, and they were giving food and blankets. There was a woman who just had a baby 3 days before, was coming in the freezing cold on a bus, 36 hours on a bus with no heat. And she said they were terrified that people were going to lose their lives as a result of the conditions. But he told me they came to the border, and the first thing they saw was this. 2 people standing at the border with yellow vests and a huge Israeli flag emblazoned onto the vest. And those were 2 representatives of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, stopping every single person who came through, every refugee, and asking them if they needed help. This man told me there was not a single other foreign government standing at the border. The Israelis were the only ones who had representation. We're a small people, but we understand what it means to really care for each other. And there he was standing at the border with a number of his friends, with 50 volunteers who were there from United Hatzalah in Israel, who met them, and who also understand what the Tzav HaSha'ah is, what is expected of all of us as we have a crisis going on. What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to do? How should we react? How should we respond? And he told me that to him, the most moving part of it was seeing those 2 officials who were sent by the Israeli government standing there and understanding the responsibility that a Jew has at a time of crisis. And as we read the Megillah this year, it's an opportunity for us to think not about tragedy. Obviously, we always need to identify with everything that's going on in the world, and current events need to make a major impact on all of us. But it's an opportunity for us to think positively about, yes, sometimes the claim against us is that we are scattered about, that we are a diverse nation, that we're all over the world, and we have pockets of communities living everywhere. But at the same time, we appreciate what it means to be the Am Segula, what it means to be the Am HaNivchar. We reimagine what it means to be a part of the dream of a Geula. We once again aspire and allow ourselves to dream what it would look like if all the Jews all over the world, when it was Rov Yisrael Shuruyim al Admasam, as we mentioned, if only we would have that opportunity to have most of the Jewish community coming back to where we belong and having that experience of a Geula once again. And as we read the story of the Megillah, and that is the entire underlying tone and theme of everything the Megillah is about, it's an opportunity for us so many generations later to just try to re-emphasize the same messages that Mordechai tried to galvanize the people to appreciate in his day. It's an opportunity for all of us to do the very same, to appreciate who we are, and to celebrate this Purim. Once again, I thank you for making this special opportunity. I wish all of you a wonderful day, and a Purim Sameach to everyone who is here and to the entire community.
So excited.
Yeah.